Hey there, my freshmen. Happy day 24. I hope you are staying warm at home if you're watching this video at home. I know that we're trying our hardest to stay warm in the school building as we learn this lesson in person, but let's pray and get right to it. Lord Jesus, thank you for this day. Thank you for watching over us when the going gets rough. I know for some school is rough right now, for others home is rough right now. Maybe for some of us both are rough right now. We're reminded, God, that you are good and you are constant, despite the roller coaster that is the year 2020. We pray, God, that you are providing healing for those who are sick or injured. We also want to pray that you are watching over us every day, allowing us to continue to learn in a safe environment as we try to build up our skills for next year and for our futures. We love you, Jesus. We pray this all in your name. Amen. So we're back to an old objective that we've used before. Students will be able to comprehend a short story, as we discussed in our last lesson video. If you haven't watched through Monday's lesson yet, we are going to be writing a literary analysis essay together. Step one of a literary analysis essay is to actually read the story that we need to analyze. So we'll do that within the course of this video here. In class today, in person, we'll be doing a little bit of pre-writing for our essay as well. We'll do the heavy lifting in class while I can work with students. For the rest of you watching this virtually, you'll get that little bit of pre-writing that we did in class in our next lesson, whether you're in person or virtual. So stay tuned on that. This video might feel a little bit longer for a single lesson video, but it is just one lesson video, and it's all I have for you today. We need to read The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, and we'll also do some annotating. We'll keep track of any details that we find that relate to our essay prompt. We'll take a look at that in just a moment here. In person, once again, we'll be doing some brainstorming to write down thesis statements and pre-writing evidence for our essay. Just a reminder that we'll be writing this essay entirely together, although we are probably going to have different thesis statements for every hour. So if you're in 5th hour, you'll have a specific video for 5th hour. Same thing with 6th, same thing with 7th, same thing with 8th. So you'll have to pay close attention to the lesson videos that are kicked out your way over these next couple of weeks. In our next lesson, after we're done pre-writing in this lesson, we're going to focus on writing introduction paragraphs. So we're going to take our essay step by step, introduction this week, along with any pre-writing and reading we need to do. Next week is the body and conclusion. Let's continue. Telltale Heart reading and annotation. Let's click it. So you're watching the video right now. I have attached the text of the story here, text Telltale Heart. I'm going to open that in another tab. You'll also note that I put a copy of our essay prompt here as well. One thing I might recommend if you're learning at home is that you either download or print this document right here, just for the sake of being as thorough as possible. To download, you'll click on the document's title right here. From there, you can print too, but I'm just going to click View for a moment. So just as a reminder, first of all, if you haven't actually read through this prompt, I recommend you go back to yesterday's lesson, or our last lesson folder, and actually watch the video where I teach you how to read a prompt. But the most important thing here, as we read The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, is we're given a theme. The theme that we will use is that fear makes people do irrational things. We need to explain how Poe develops that theme. So as I read, within the course of this video, I'm going to do my best to highlight, to annotate, really anything I see that shows this theme, that fear makes people do irrational, foolish things. We'll focus on any elements that Poe uses to develop that theme. So we'll look at words, we'll look at characters, at plot events, at the setting, at the point of view, all of that stuff. You'll notice there is a spot for thesis writing. Once again, we'll be doing this in class today. So I'll have my in-class learners help me write thesis statements. We'll do a little bit of pre-writing as well. For you today, you really just need to read the story with me. Let's do it. So you'll notice on this text, there is this box for annotations out to the right. Once again, if you can download or print this document, that's the most ideal thing you can do to get some practice here. The best I can do for annotating here in Schoology is by using the Select Text button. So this allows me to highlight anything that I think is important. I think what I'll do is read this maybe paragraph by paragraph, maybe a couple paragraphs at a time, and identify anything that shows our theme of fear causing people to do irrational things. I should note right here, Edgar Allan Poe, if you're not familiar with him, kind of the granddaddy of the American horror story, wrote a lot of short stories. Most of them are pretty twisted. I figured it was timely for Halloween. It's also good practice for next year. In English one, you will be tackling another one of his stories, The Cask of Amontillado, which is a little bit longer and a little more complicated than this one. And then in English 2, you'll have another one, probably Fall of the House of Usher. But we'll see. This is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in heaven and in earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. We can do a little bit of annotating already. So once again, if you have your own copy of this, or if you've downloaded this, one thing I would recommend identifying, annotating, is that we have a first-person narrator here. So notice, narrator considers himself I, and also reveals some stuff about himself as well. I think we can assume that the narrator is male, but we have this first-person narrator who claims, first of all, that he is not crazy. Mad here means crazy. So the narrator says, hey, why must you think that I'm crazy? I'm not crazy. Although he says he's not crazy, he does say that he's sick. The disease had sharpened my senses. That made me hear even better. And then he says, I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. So our narrator swears up and down that he's not crazy, but he seems pretty crazy to me. Think about that for a moment. We talked about how the theme is that fear makes people do irrational things. Here, the narrator basically tells us that he is irrational. The narrator tells us that there's something wrong with him. He claims he's not mad, but also admits, really on the opposite side of that same coin, that he is sick and hears things that aren't there. And he even says, how can I be crazy if I can tell you this story as calmly as I can? So here he kind of introduces himself as part of the exposition here. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Once again, another little word to identify there that might help us to understand that our narrator is a little bit crazy and a little bit neurotic and nervous. This term haunted right here. An idea haunted him. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Really, here's where the exposition kind of comes to an end right here, and we realize that there's some conflict too. Our narrator acknowledges here that an idea has been haunting him. The idea, he finally makes up his mind. He makes up his mind that he has to kill this old man that he lives with. He says that he loves the old man, right? But he feels like he has to kill the old man, not for his money, not out of hatred, but because he's afraid of this man's eye. He says it resembles that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. So, once again, an irrational thing. This is not a good reason to want to kill someone, right? It's very, very, very irrational. And what causes this narrator to make this decision? Because this man's eye scares him a little bit. Maybe a lot. But, again, irrational. Another idea to note right there. If we discuss this in plot, we could note that the exposition does show that fear causes people to do irrational things. This narrator's idea to kill this old man is born out of fear, and that's the initial conflict in this story. It's an internal conflict, a fear that the narrator has. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad, you think I'm crazy. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight. Ah, a little vocab connection right there. Foresight right there. So wisdom about the future. How he carefully planned out his murder attempt. With what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it. oh so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, yes, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his head. Ha! What a madman would have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. Notice the capitalization on evil eye right there. Again, just a reminder that the root of this narrator's fear is this old man's eye. There's also some other irrational things in this paragraph, right? Like the fact that when he says that he took an hour, it took him an hour to place his head within an opening of a door. So imagine how slowly you need to move to take 60 minutes to place your head within a doorway. Again, irrational. Same thing with this. So first of all, watching someone sleep is not a normal thing to do. But he mentions that he did it for 7 nights. Every night at midnight, he peeks into this man's room and watches him sleep, just waiting for him to open his eyes so he can kill him. What? And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber, and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door, little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened, through fear of robbers. Interesting, I've never noticed this before, but this little side note right here that the shutters are closed because they themselves are afraid of robbers, right? Brings in that theme of fear. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily, steadily. One thing that we should keep an eye out for in annotation is ideas of blindness or not being able to see, right? I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily, steadily. His room is pitch black. You can't see anything in this room. Even if we look back earlier, right here, the first description of the man's eye, one of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Maybe some of you have like elderly relatives who might have that kind of filmy or milky look in their eyes. That's glaucoma. Or cataracts or glaucoma. It's a disease that leads to blindness, right? It's very possible that this old man is actually blind, and what this man fears, what the narrator fears, is this man's blind eye. Let's continue. I had my head in, and I was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle. Again, really irrational. And in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no! It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up in my own bosom, deepening, with its dreadful echo, the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him, He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney, it is only a mouse crossing the floor," or "It is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he has been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found them all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. Something to consider here. There's a line that I want to annotate right here earlier. He says here that there's this low stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. It's a sound he knows well. He mentions that it's a sound that is welled up in his own bosom, deepening the terrors that distracted him. So he is talking about this sound that the old man makes, like it's a sound that everyone makes. I don't know about you, but this is never a sound that I have made, right? It is the low stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. No, never, never. Once again, this narrator claims up and down that he's not crazy, but even this very description right here of something that he deals with that no one else really does is a sign that he's crazy. Once again, his fear, the terrors that distract him, are causing him to do irrational things, like stalk this man and attempt to kill him. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot from out the crevice and up full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And now have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? I should have been counting on our way through the story. How many times does this narrator have to tell us he's not crazy? We'll go back and count that before we finish this video. Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates a soldier into courage. Once again, another sound that this man claims he hears, but can we hear it? Can we even hear our own heartbeats most of the time, let alone someone else's heartbeat at a distance from ourselves? I don't think so. Again, this narrator is crazy. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. Our narrator can hear this man's heartbeat, and he says the old man's terror must have been extreme. A question that we might raise here is, whose heartbeat is he hearing? Is he hearing the old man's heartbeat, or is he hearing his own? Is it his own fear, his own nervousness that's causing him to feel this way? And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still, but the beating grew louder, louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily, to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was dead, stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. So notice once again the description of the old man's heartbeat. his heartbeat on with a muffled sound, so the heartbeat's going less and less and less until he can't hear it anymore. Once again, I think a more accurate theory here is that it's his own heart that he was hearing, not the old man's heart. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. Whoa, wait a second here. So, not only does our narrator kill this man by smothering him with a bed, pulled the heavy bed over him so he smothers him to death. Not only does he do that, but he dismembers this man. He cuts off his head and his arms and legs, he says, for the concealment of the body. But does he really need to do that to hide a dead body? This could be phrased as being pretty irrational as well. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. Ha ha. Laughter to describe a tub capturing every drop of blood from a dismembered man's body. Again, irrational. This man's going crazy. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search, and search well. I led them, at length, to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room, and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. So what might be interesting in this paragraph is that this is the most logically our narrator behaves at any point in this story, right? He makes up a story. He says that the scream that people heard in the middle of the night was his own. He was having a nightmare. This is actually a bit of an ironic statement. We'll talk about irony next semester, but he says that the shriek was his own in a dream. This could be phrased in a literary analysis sort of context here. This could basically be admission that what the narrator has committed was done all in fear. That the scream, the fear, the terror that he feels, this fear he has for the old man's eye is all in his head. It's another way of saying that, hey, I did it because I'm crazy. He has them search his chamber. He shows them all the old man's treasures. So he shows that, you know what, this guy wasn't robbed and that he didn't rob him, right? He also places his own chair upon the very spot where the man is buried. So that makes it less likely that the police officers are going to find the old man's body in that spot. Our narrator is pretty clear thinking in this paragraph. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But, ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles, in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observation of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Oh my God, no, no, they heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear the hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark! Louder, 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 louder! Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. And thus ends our story. I read rather quickly there for dramatic effect in those last couple paragraphs, but a few things to note right here as we talk about how the narrator's fear drives him to do irrational things. Notice all the descriptions the narrator gives of himself in this last big paragraph here. He grows pale first. He talks faster. The pitch of his voice goes up. He can hear a sound in his ears. He gasps for breath. So he hyperventilates. He talks faster and faster. He starts getting angrier and angrier with violent gesticulations. He's pacing back and forth with heavy strides. He starts to rave and swear. He swings the chair. He grates it upon the boards. He starts acting more and more irrational and crazy. He feels that he has to scream or die. I think what we can note in this paragraph is that our narrator is having a panic attack or a fear attack, right? It starts off small. His skin grows pale. He starts to talk faster. The pitch of his voice goes up. But by the end of this paragraph, he's full-blown panic attack. He's running around. He feels he has to scream or die. The sound in his ears is pounding louder and louder and louder. It could very well be the pounding of his own heart because the police officers cannot hear this, right? It's probably his own heartbeat, as we see here. And notice that it drives him to do the last irrational thing in this text, and it's to turn himself in. Our narrator came so close to committing murder, or getting away with murder here. The police never would have suspected, never would have found this dead body, and yet at the very end, he tells the police officers to tear up the planks because the dead body is under the floorboards. One thing that I almost forgot about there was that we were going to count how many times our narrator claims that he is not crazy in this story. That might make for a good avenue to take in our literary analysis essay, or it might not. Just depends on what we decide in class today for the route that we're going to take with this essay. Again, stay tuned in our next lesson for that, but let's count. Why will you say that I'm mad? That's 1. How then am I mad? That's 2. 3, you fancy me mad, madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. That's 3. 4, and now have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the senses? If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer. That's 5, and that should be it. So 5 different times throughout the course of this story, our narrator claims that he is not crazy, and yet, as we read through the entire story, it goes from relatively normal in the first paragraph, that he says that he has this kind of irrational idea that goes into his brain, until the end of the story where he's yelling at police officers to rip up his floorboards because he can hear the dead man's heart beating under the floorboards. He goes from point A to point B, even though he claims that he's not crazy, 5 times in the process. So once again, as we look back at our daily agenda right here, you're done for today. You've read through our story. We're going to do a little bit of the heavy lifting in class as we brainstorm the thesis statement and pre-write some evidence together. It all depends on what your classmates in class decide what we should write our essay about. So the thesis statement is going to drive the rest of our thinking. So you'll actually get our thesis statement in our next lesson along with our introduction. Speaking of next lesson, you'll also be taking your vocabulary quiz, words F through K, in our next lesson. So please use this time, if you haven't studied yet, to study up on your words for vocab quiz F through K. I did grade the ones that are online, so you have a chance to look back through your online answers and my comments there. In our next lesson, after our vocab quiz, we'll be writing our essay introduction together anyway. So stay tuned.